morning. Welcome to our science seminar for today. We have a couple more to go after this one. So stay tuned in April, okay, for more science seminars. Today we have with us Shelby Laird. She comes from Stephen F. Austin, which is just down the street, down there toward Nacogdoches. A little way. If you've ever been to Nacogdoches, you should go visit. It's a pretty little town. Stephen F. Austin, a pretty campus, all those trees around, things like that. So, and she comes to us with a PhD in forestry from North Carolina State University. And she also has a Master's of Education from North Carolina State University with emphasis in science education. And she has a Bachelor of Science from, where do you think? North Carolina State University.
They're all the same.
Yep.
Yeah.
And there her major is science education and earth science. So she's big in education, so I think she's going to be educating us today about the exciting things going on in forestry. If you have more questions about forestry or the SFA program, I'm sure she'll answer some at the end of her talk, but also I would encourage you to join us for lunch. We'll be in the Joyce Room of the Corner Cafe. If you want to hear more about Stephen F. Austin and the forestry program, or Nacogdoches, and how to spell that, yes, and things like that, please join us for lunch after the talk. But for now, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Laird.
It's a wider room than I'm used to, so bear with me while I try to make contact with the whole room. So, yeah, I'm going to explain maybe my degrees a little bit to help you out, because it's a little weird that I went to the same university for everything that happened. So, about me, real quick. So, I went to school originally to be a teacher. I was a science teacher. I basically have a double major in geology, but I didn't do the paperwork. So, I did that for 4 years. It was very eye-opening for me. I was kind of a science nerd all through school, not as much of a people person, and then trying to explain that science to kids who really didn't want to be in class and in science class was very interesting experience for me. So from there, I decided to go back to graduate school originally because I was going to get more pay as a teacher, right? You're going to get more pay. And then I fell in love with something called GIS, which is Geographic Information Science or Systems, depending on who you talk to. So GIS is basically mapping, but in a very complex way. You can do mathematical statistics with spatial statistics. So it's really fun. So I fell in love with that, and that at the university that I went to for my master's degree was in the forestry program. So I finished my master's up in education, but then I left teaching totally and decided to go and do this forestry stuff. And so that forestry stuff has fortunately taken me like all the way around the world. So my job previous to, so I graduated with my PhD. My research work was both technical and focused on people. So I tend to be one of those scientists who straddles two worlds. So I have 1 foot over here in natural sciences and 1 foot over here in social sciences. And so that's a very bizarre place to be. If you know anything about science and how science works, it's hard to be in between those two places. So my postdoc was at Coweta Hydrologic Laboratory, which is a U.S. Forest Service Southern Research Station research site. And it was hard natural science, climate science specifically. So I researched, I helped a bunch of Southern Research Station foresters write a book for land managers that deals with climate change and how they can adapt their land management strategies based on all of the different climate scenarios. So from best case scenario to worst case scenario, and how they might use trees and use best forestry practices to manage their land for things to come. So that was a really exciting postdoc, but then postdocs are temporary and you have to find a job. So if you're really desperate for a full-time job, you just start applying everywhere. So I applied for jobs everywhere, and I got this great job at Charles Sturt University, which is a little regional university, sort of like SFA is, but in Albury, New South Wales, Australia. And so I spent 3 years teaching there, and that program was entirely parks-based. So I went from doing this really natural science, climate science work to working in parks. And it was a big sort of shift for me. Fortunately, I had those feet in both worlds and I could kind of do that shift. But it was a really great experience. And then we decided it was too far away to manage family. So we moved back to the United States, and SFA just happened to be where I landed. So this is a recent picture of my family. We got to travel to the Badlands National Park. And the reason I love this picture is because it's very sciencey. There's a science thing happening in this picture. Can you see what's happening to my hair? See how it's standing up? So there was a really big thunderstorm behind us in this picture. And so we were on a little metal platform with a thunderstorm happening kind of from the perspective of where the camera was. The thunderstorm's over there. And we looked at the picture after we took this picture, the little selfie with the camera, and we went, is our hair standing up? And we looked at each other, and our hair was all standing up, and we ran as fast as we could back to the car. I didn't see the lightning strike anywhere near there, but it was the craziest thing ever. It was my favorite. So now it's my favorite science picture to give because we're sitting there with our hair just standing up, awaiting the lightning that fortunately did not hit us. So that's a little bit about me, just so you have some background. So I want to talk to you today about something that I research that I feel is very important for the entire field of forestry and environmental science, and that's connection to nature. So can you think of a time, probably in your childhood, where you were outdoors that you remember very vividly? So a vivid memory you have of being outside. I have one where I was in my neighborhood, where I lived in a very suburban sort of environment when I grew up. But we had this giant, dry creek bed gully thing behind all the houses. And so there was, behind my next door neighbor's house, there was this giant, well, to me, I was this tall. But there was this giant, it was probably about 20 foot, just cliff slope. And it had a few trees growing into the side of it, but mostly it was just a dirt, clay kind of cliff drop off. And one of my favorite memories from my childhood is when I finally climbed that thing. It took all of my courage to be able to do this, and it was clay, so you would walk up a few steps and slide all the way back down because it was like this, the slope. And so that to me is a very formative memory for me outdoors. Well, connection to nature is the psychological science of trying to measure those experiences and measure how people connect to the natural world. So really it's rooted in environmental psychology work. So I'm going to talk to you real quick about this project that I'm working on. It's a meta-analysis, so we'll talk a little bit about what that means in terms of statistics. And then we'll go through the results of it. This has been an ongoing project. It's like a project that will never end. Yes, it goes on and on, my friends. So I've finished it now, and the paper's getting sent out in a week. So this is hot off the presses kind of stuff now because I'm done. And when you do a meta-analysis, the problem is people keep on publishing papers you want to include in your meta-analysis. And you have to just say eventually, I'm ending it this date. Nothing after that date is going in my paper. That's it. It's done. The problem is that my preliminary analysis was very inconclusive on one of the things that I was looking at. And so I wanted more studies. So I waited until they came out, and they came out and it didn't help. So I'm just going to publish it. So, for about a couple of hundred years, probably more, people have been making this sort of assumption that we were once connected to nature in a very meaningful way, and we've lost that connection somehow. So, you can read some early works of Thoreau, right? And he's going to talk about how the city folks are all city folks, and how connected he is to nature out in his little cabin, right? So, even since his time, there have been people who've talked about how we've lost this sort of connection to nature. People find evidence in the fact that no one knows how to grow their own food anymore. People don't understand, what wild plants are. I've seen there's at least one study, I don't think it got published, it was more of a white paper, that children today could identify more corporate logos than they can leaves of trees. If you think about that, you probably can think of yourself, yeah, I could identify more corporate logos without names on them than I could leaves of trees. And that's even true for me, and I teach in a forestry program, so that's saying something. They use 200-something logos to test this with children for companies, and 200 different leaves. And of course, think if you know 200 different species of trees or plants. Probably not. So the crux of the problem, though, often gets credited to this journalist called Richard Louv. So he wrote a book in 2005 called The Last Child in the Woods. It's a very interesting read if you're into this sort of thing. He basically went around and talked to a bunch of researchers and wrote a sort of journalistic summary of the problem. And he coined this term nature deficit disorder. So sometimes you will hear the word nature deficit disorder. It's meant to be, his hypothesis is, all of our modern ailments are a result of this disconnect from nature. E.O. Wilson kind of coined the term biophilia. There's a cute little beetle down here. Speaking of nature, there it is. So E.O. Wilson coined this term biophilia, and so that sort of hypothesis tends to flow along with this idea of nature deficit disorder. So, connection to nature has been studied primarily by environmental psychologists, and I realized when I first made this presentation, and I've modified it over time, that I had 1 decade in there, and now I had to move it up to 2 decades. So it's time to publish the paper. So, basically, there's a separate line of research going on this too by health professionals. So there's some research that seems to indicate that your health and well-being are actually better the more exposure you get to the natural world. There was a 1982 sort of seminal study of people who they were looking at people who were recovering from surgery, and people who could see greenery out of their window in their hospital bed recovered from surgery faster and complained of less pain than those who saw a brick building out of their hospital window. So there is some a separate line of research beyond the research in the natural resources realm. There's a whole separate line of research going on in the medical realm that tends to indicate the same thing, that there is something to do with the greater exposure we have to even just greenery and plants and our health and well-being, and that those things are tied together. So, a little bit about environmental education. So environmental education is a field that kind of grew out of education and grew out of the environmental sciences. Essentially, it seeks to connect people to the environment in a meaningful way. So there might be a knowledge component, like you might want to teach people about species of trees. Basically, everything we do in our forestry department at SFA is environmental education. We're taking you outside and educating you about some aspect of the natural environment, right? A lot of times when you see things associated with environmental ed, they'll say that they teach people how to think and not what to think. That's because environmental education often gets vilified as a thing that's indoctrinating people into some sort of like hippie cult of environmentalism. And that would not be the goal. The goal would be to actually teach people how to think about environmental issues. So how to study things, from a science perspective in order to, and a social science perspective in order to affect change, hopefully in a positive way for the natural world. So a lot of times you're going to see these, so I work with a lot of environmental education providers, and they all claim that their programs are connecting people to nature. Come on our nature hike and we'll connect you with the natural world. Come and send your kids to nature camp and we'll connect them to nature. If you start, now that I've told you that, if you see any of those ads for like nature camps or anything, you'll see it. You'll see them claiming that they're connecting people to nature. Well, I have a science brain, and science brains don't like claims that don't have evidence, right? We want claims that have evidence. That's how it works. So here are some assumptions that people are making, and I wanted to try and test those assumptions. And so I'll show you which ones we're looking at. But basically, what these people were claiming that their programs would do is if we take people outside, I don't think the pointer was working on here today, but if we take people outside, they connect to nature, and then we hope that they're going to do some sort of action for the environment, right? Or we take them outside, we connect into nature, and then they think about the environment in a more positive way. They have a pro-environmental attitude. That means that they might love nature. Now, loving nature and actually doing something to help nature are two different things. So don't confuse those two concepts, because attitudes and behaviors are two different things. Just because you know you should recycle, does that mean that you do recycle all the time? No. So don't confuse those two concepts. The other assumption is that we do this environmental ed program with them. They're going to gain some kind of knowledge. Now, I'm not looking at all at the knowledge part of it. So that's for your teachers to do on a test sometime, right? Check for knowledge. I'm not looking at that. And then people assume that if they get that knowledge, then they'll demonstrate either the pro-environmental attitude or behavior. Just because you know more about how the world works does not mean that you care about it more or will demonstrate a behavior towards it. Those are actually assumptions. So the things that I'm looking at are these kind of 4 things. So these 4 arrows right here. So if we do an EE program with them or we take them outside, does that connect them to nature? And then if they're connected to nature, do they actually demonstrate more pro-environmental behaviors or attitudes? So the 4 things that I'm testing with this meta-analysis are those 4 arrows, basically. So does EE or outdoor exposure increase connection to nature, and is connection to nature correlated with pro-environmental attitudes and behaviors? Those are the basic research questions of this project. So, primary sources of data included Google Scholar. Primo Search was my old library search in Australia. I've also used, Web of Science and a few other different sorts of databases to try and collect articles at this point. And we've done just a snowballing sampling technique. So if I find an article that cites another article that might be relevant to the study, then of course we'll look at that one too. Trying to get a comprehensive list. One of the problems with meta-analysis, and I think I talk about this in limitations, is that you can end up with something called publication bias. So what publication bias means is that you're looking at all these studies that have been published, but it leaves out studies that didn't have a result. So people who have an exciting result want to publish it, and they want to get it out there into the science world so other people know about it. But if you do an experiment and you kind of get, nothing, do you publish that? Not usually. You're going to usually see a bunch of stuff. And part of that has to do with the journals, the scientific journals. They're not going to publish your paper if it has no result. They want to have some sort of result to be able to say, look, this new thing is contributing to the literature. They don't want to just have it be, they found nothing. So you get this publication bias when you do a meta-analysis. So because of that, we also included graduate student theses when there was one available. So those tend to get published online a lot now. So we included those, and then I had a couple of sets of my own personal raw data that hadn't been published, and I got one from a graduate student who's now a professor in Maine. But she at the time, and she hasn't since then published her data, but she had some data from a project. So I tried to include a few different studies that hadn't been published just to try and avoid that publication bias a little bit. So this is not the most updated list. There are more than this, but these are all the articles that got included, and then like which categories they were included in. So of the 4 things, environmental attitudes, behaviors. So that means they had to have a scale that measured one of these things for them to fit in. I'm going to talk to you real quick about scales, which I know is not the most exciting thing in the world, so bear with me. So the meta-analysis itself basically is this, it's a statistical way of combining all of the data using the effect size of each of the studies. So you have to be able to calculate that effect size. You can, the software that I use, this comprehensive meta-analysis 3.0, it's pretty good software, and it's typically a medical field software. So this software originated in the medical field. The reason medical the medical field would want to do a whole bunch of meta-analyses is because of studies like, the salt. Is salt bad for you or not? What do you think? How many people think it's bad for you, salt?
Too much.
Well, depends.
Good for you, salt? Maybe?
Small amount.
A few more? So the problem and the reason that we get confused on that is because there have been a whole bunch of studies published, and sometimes they come out one way and sometimes they come out another way, and it depends. It depends on the group of people they studied. It depends on the strength of the study. Depends on the longitude of the study, how long it was. There are all kinds of different factors that make it depend. The idea of a meta-analysis from the medical perspective was that we're going to take all this data, drill it all down to each study's effect size, and then use that to try and figure out what it actually is. Is it good for you or bad for you? And so that's where this idea of meta-analysis came from. So I decided to use that statistical tool to do what I wanted to do, which was drill down and see, okay, do these things, are they really true or not? Because there are a whole bunch of studies coming out that seem to show one or the other. So limitations, I've talked about publication bias, and also the variable methods between the studies that are included. So particularly for the environmental behavior one, for the studies that I used, sometimes people just said, do you recycle? Well, if you ask a person if they recycle, what are they going to tend to say? Yes?
Supposed to say yes.
Right? Because they're supposed because they're supposed to say yes. They know that that's what they're supposed to say. Some of the studies actually measured people and watched if they recycled. There's actually one really cool study where they had people sit down and do a little questionnaire, and then at the end, as a thank you, they offered them a little snack and then asked them if they wanted a plastic bag when they left. So one of the questions on the questionnaire had said, do you take plastic bags to the grocery store, or do you bring your own bag? So the idea was to test them and see if they really, bring their own bag, or if they would take the plastic bag, because they asked, like the snack that they gave them was a little tiny thing, like they could fit it in their backpack. These were college students, right? So it wasn't something that they needed a bag for. So if they took the extraneous plastic bag, the idea was they really didn't care about the plastic bags issue, right? And so sneakily they did that and then recorded who took the bag and who didn't, and then compared it to what they said on their sheets. So we know from studies like that that people will tend to say that they do the thing that is the expected social norm, whether they do that or not. So so some of the limitations in this, particularly in environmental behavior, is going to be an overestimation of the positive behavior, the pro-environmental behavior. I just want to talk to you real quick about some of the scales that are used to measure connection to nature, because you're thinking, how do people measure that? How do you collect data on that? You may have been thinking that, you may not have, but I'm assuming that you were thinking that, because your critical mind, your critical science brain was thinking, how can you measure that? Right? So this is one scale that's used. This is actually a one-question scale, so it's not very valid in terms. It's hard to test its reliability. I like it because it's visual, though, and so you can look at. I'm a visual person, and visual people like visual things. So I like that it's very clear that yourself and nature are separate, and then they are one and the same. And so, which one do you think you are? So I tend to use that one along with other scales just because I want to compare the results. Other people who have done that, other environmental psychologists who have done that, have come up to similar results to what I have in that. This is measuring something slightly different from the actual written scales. So here's an example of one of the written scales. It's a little hard to read because I took a screenshot of it. So I'm just going to read a few of the questions to you so you can understand what kinds of questions are on these. So the first one says, my ideal vacation spot would be a remote wilderness area. The second one says, I always think about how my actions affect the environment. The third one says, my connection to nature and the environment is a part of my spirituality. The fourth one says, I take notice of wildlife wherever I am. The fifth one says, my relationship to nature is an important part of who I am. And then the sixth one says, I feel very connected to all living things and the earth. So you can see that this is a self-assessment, and people are going to have to ask themselves this question, and then they give a response. In this case, it's on a 1 to 5 Likert scale, from not really agreeing to agreeing a lot. So this is actually the short form. It's only 6 questions of this. This questionnaire actually has 21 questions total if you do the entire long form, so they're very similar questions to these. But just to give you an idea of what a connection to nature scale looks like, the thing that we're testing. There's a whole bunch of different ones because after this concept was sort of evolved in the literature, then have you noticed that everyone in science wants to have their name on a thing? Or to name a thing? That's a thing that scientists like to do. They either want to have their name on the thing or be the one who created the thing that everyone uses. Yeah? So here's all the people attempting to be the one that everyone uses. From the literature I've seen, no one has picked one yet, and it's almost 20 years later. So everyone's still competing over who's going to be the one that gets the thing. This person, Tam, in 2013, he actually went through and he created his own scale and at the same time measured all the other ones to see if they were all measuring the same thing. And his conclusion was, yeah, they're all measuring the same thing. Here's my scale that I think is better, that measures the same thing. So all the time we're getting new scales for this. I am not an environmental psychologist, so I don't make new scales. I just use other people's things. So if I wanted to, I could get into it with an environmental psychologist and we could make a new scale, but I don't think that's necessary at this point because there are about 15 different ones to choose from. So when you put in all your studies and all your information, you get this crazy output from this software. And so what it's giving you basically, it says correlation at the top. It's really, it's a correlation, but it's really the effect size is what they're using to compute this. And it's based on the strength of the study. So the confidence intervals that we're getting here are based on the strength of the study. So the correlation overall between connection to nature and environmental attitudes is pretty strong. This is 0.5. So that's a pretty strong relationship when you're talking correlation. And you note that the confidence interval, it's pretty narrow. They're pretty confident in this data. This is pretty solid data that it's going to be about half. So half, you could phrase it, there are different ways to phrase statistics that make more sense than others. You could phrase it something like, you could say that half of your environmental attitude relates to how connected to nature you are, if you wanted to. That's not an entirely accurate phrase, but it's one of the ways you can put it that makes it a little easier to understand. Behavior comes out to about 0.4, but you can see also it's a really close relationship. These two have been the same since I started this study. And you can kind of tell when you look at all the studies that were input, and even for the last one, other than there are a few, for the most part, they're pretty clearly in the positive relationship correlation sort of area, right? Now this is correlation, not necessarily causation. Remember how I had direction arrows before? So just because I'm saying that it's not the cause, it's just correlated to each other. So we know that the two things are related to each other in a very close way, right? And so environmental behaviors and connection to nature are related to each other in a very close way too. Now, a little less strong relationship, but still very strong. Where it gets funky, and this I have a different looking picture because I tried to put in my last data, like I tried to run the data right before I left, which is why I got here like 5 minutes ahead of time. Because I just had a student enter some data yesterday, so I wanted to make sure it was all up to date for your presentation. And so this is the outdoor exposure category. So what this means is that in these studies, somebody took some people outside and then probably measured their connection to nature before and after. Sometimes they had a treatment and control, sometimes they did not. So if they had a treatment or control, obviously this is going to give you better data for here, right? If they didn't have the treatment and control, a little bit less quality data. And so, which you can sort of see reflected in all the different studies that came out of this. One of the studies was just at a university in Canada. They had the students walk across campus in tunnels versus walking across campus outside. Because they get snow, right, in Canada. And so they have tunnels all around campus that you can walk through to get to class in case there's too much snow and you can't get to class. If you're ever wondering how people who live in snowy areas get to class in the snow, well, they get to walk in tunnels, so they don't get out of class for snow like we do. So we can't handle an eighth of an inch without a break. Yeah.
If you look at really old pictures of Laterno campus, they actually used to have the equivalent of corridors that would take you from building to building. I suppose that was, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so tunnels are not a rare thing. I know I went to a residential high school and we had tunnels that would take you between buildings too. But they did this really cool study where it took them about 15 minutes to walk across campus, either in the tunnels or on the surface. They had them walk in the spring, so it was nice outside, very pretty. And then they measured their connection to nature before the walk and after the walk. So after a 15-minute walk, there was a difference between the connection to nature of the people who walk outside versus walking in the tunnels, which is sort of crazy to think about that 15 minutes of outdoor time could actually impact that. But that's what they found. So this is just outdoor exposure. No education was implemented, just taking someone outside and doing something with them and then measuring the difference. So we still get a pretty... Sorry, this is our zero line here. So we're still getting, I ran it fixed and random effects. I'm running the random effects because I think that, and I get to this later, I think, but I think that the random effects helps to account for the high variability of the different scales better, and also the different kinds of things that people are doing as the thing that they're measuring. So some people let people walk outside for 15 minutes. Some people went on a week-long camp. They went to a week-long outdoor camp versus a basketball camp. So, using the random effects model, I hope will help account for that a little bit more. But usually what you'll see because of that is a much higher kind of range here for the sort of confidence interval that's involved in that. So this one is the one that, as a person who works with a lot of educators and environmental educators, was really interesting to me. So this is the environmental education one, and this is the one that we've been collecting data up till very recently on to try and see what's happening. And so this is why that fixed and random model can be super important when you're running it, because if we just run this fixed model on the meta-analysis, it actually shows a positive correlation there. But if you run the random model, it crosses 0. So we have an issue. So running the random model, running the random model is better, I think, for this data because of the high variability, again, of the education programs that were involved in that. And so the relationship is definitely still undetermined. So when people claim that an environmental ed program connects students or people to nature, that may or may not be true. We still don't have enough data to be able to say that one way or the other. So some of the limitations and strengths of this, there were different interventions. And so particularly with the outdoor exposure and the environmental ed, again, some of them used a control and a treatment group and some of them did not. The effect, fortunately, in meta-analysis, using that effect size helps to account for that and the strength of the results of the studies that you're inputting. But still, it creates a lot of variability within that. And then in one of the really recent environmental education studies, they actually looked at a college biology course at a university, and one of the professors claims that he works with the students not on the content knowledge of biology, but on their connection to the natural world. And so they compared his sections of the biology class where he focuses solely on connection of the students to the natural world versus the biology sessions where they went in and taught knowledge biology. And so there was a difference between those two classes, but you would expect that, right? Like if I say I'm going to focus on connecting you to something, then you would expect to have a gain in the connection to something. Now, interestingly, they didn't compare the grades on any sort of knowledge test between the two classes, which would have been really interesting because it would have been interesting to see if, while focusing on this connection, if they were also learning the content knowledge as well as the students who were focusing on the content knowledge. They didn't include that in their study, but it's kind of something that I've started to note as if we say we're going to focus on this, then we should. I'm hoping that using the random effects model for the meta-analysis is accounting for some of that scale of variability. And what I'm hoping to do is use this meta-analysis to drive further research in this field. So I'm hoping that by publishing this data and saying, look, we're claiming that this thing is happening and it's not really, or we're not sure, that people will start to kind of do more measurements of their programs. Right now, you don't get a lot of measurements of outcomes of like camps and stuff. Like when you get to camp, and no one wants to go to camp and take a test either, right? It's like you don't want to go to camp and be like, oh, here's a test at the beginning and a test at the end. It doesn't count for anything either. So then getting people to cooperate is a whole different story. But I want people to be accountable for what they say. If you're going to make a claim about something, and again, this is science working overtime, then you need to have some data to back that up. So what I just said, don't make assumptions about things without backing up with some data. Funny story, so I teach the introductory class for forestry at SFA, and we have a bunch of the other professors will come and do guest lectures. They do that so that the students who are coming in as freshmen can get to know the other professors and see who they are, who they'll have later on. One of the professors comes in, and he's the silviculture professor. And he says, all those urban people who grew up in cities don't understand how forestry works, and none of them understand that clear cutting is not going to build a shopping mall, and none of them understand that that the forest is going to regrow. And so I asked him after his first kind of guest lecture in my class, the first year I started, I said, well, do you have evidence of that? Do you have evidence that people don't know from urban areas about forestry? And he said, I don't. And so he went and looked it up, and he looked up the literature on it, and there's no data that shows that people from urban areas know more or less about forests or environmental science than people from rural areas. There's absolutely no data on that whatsoever. So when you're making claims about people, it's just like any other field of science, you need to make sure you got some data to back it up. You don't want to just make an assumption based on your conversation with a couple of people. That's anecdotal evidence. That is not actual evidence. So just making sure that we're understanding that. And then the health research continues to show this really positive effect of nature on people. And so there's a really compelling reason that we want to try and connect people to nature if we can, because it seems to show a really positive health outcome for people. ADHD symptoms are lessened within exposure to nature. Your well-being generally increases. So as your connection to nature increases, well-being tends to increase along with it. These two things are highly correlated to each other. So even just going outside, even those students who took that 15-minute walk outside are going to feel a little bit better after that. So making sure that we understand what's going on and why that's going on, and then how we can use that to benefit people would be really great. We got a virtual reality laboratory now at SFA, and I was thinking the other day about this research project I thought would be great, where we could go and have people sit there in virtual nature, and then have some other people go out in regular nature and see if there's a difference. And then I went, oh, we have to do it on the one perfect day in East Texas, where the day, it was last week I think, the day where there's no bugs, and it's 70 degrees, and there's a nice little breeze, and the sun is out. That one day that would be spring, because otherwise it's going to be too hot. So what I'm worried about is that the people who are in the virtual nature will be like, yeah, this is awesome. There's no bugs, and I'm comfortable because I'm inside. And the people in the actual nature outside will be out there in the summer, and it'll be 90 degrees, and they're dripping sweat, and 400 mosquitoes are on them, and they'll be like, oh God, I hate it. It's miserable. So working out how you do that study would be really important to think about. But some of the things that I've been thinking about doing. So there's the thing about the assumption. Sorry, I've changed the order of this presentation a couple of times, and every time I do it in the wrong order. So that's Mother Nature on her deathbed there. Just it's kind of, I don't know. I found that where I thought it was kind of interesting. So there's a lot of assumptions that we make. So one of the assumptions that's really commonly made in this is that urban people are more disconnected from nature. You'll get a lot of people saying that if you grew up in a city that you're not very connected to nature and that rural people are, but we're actually finding in some preliminary data that I have that that's not the case. Really it depends on how much you go outside versus where you grew up. So you could be in a city and be in a vacant lot playing around, and that's just as much nature exposure as someone who is in a rural area but never leaves their house, even though they have beautiful woods all around them. So, the place is not actually as important as the amount of time you spend outside. So just making sure that we don't make those assumptions. Some future things I'm thinking about, which I already talked to you about. There's some evidence that you can't connect to nature that it's harder for you to connect to nature after about the age of 12. So you tend to be a lot more malleable before the age of 12, and then after that, you tend to fall off. We know the same is actually true for females in science careers. So females in science careers, females tend to gain a lot of interest in science up until about the age of 12, and then we start losing females' interest in science. So there's something about that, like puberty onset hormone thing that's happening around the age of 12, maybe that impacts this. And some of the connection to nature studies actually show this. They worked with kids who were under that age and over that age at camps, and the ones who were under, actually their connection to nature changed over the course of the camp, but the ones who were over it didn't. So that's something, but there's only one study on that, so that needs to be looked into a little bit more. Yeah, let's see what else I got. So one of the sneaky reasons that I'm interested in this is because it has to do with careers in natural resources. So forestry, environmental science, agriculture. We tend to get more people in those fields who are more connected to nature and who tended to have those formative experiences outdoors when they were young. So for us, this kind of research is more about creating more people who will be active in our field, creating more people who want to go out and do like water quality research in a stream, or finding more people who want to do air quality research around hog farms to see the kinds of air pollution that they have, or having people who really want to go traipse through the woods in 90 degrees in the summer in East Texas to track wildlife or to measure trees. So the more people that we can get that are connected to nature in this way, then for us it's sort of career longevity. The more people we get in our field too. So that's one of the reasons why it's important. And that is all.
So, questions for Dr. Laird?
That's not me. That's someone in front of me that I took a picture of.
So how do you measure a connection to nature?
Yeah, so you have to give somebody a scale. And so that was those questions on that little scale. And they get to bubble in their answers. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Okay, speaking to my own experience is always a little dangerous for this size anecdotal ways of knowing things. But I can say that from my own personal experience, going out into nature has always been a much more positive experience than having an environmental education program.
Yeah.
But every time I've gone through those programs, there's always a part of me that thinks it's because the program isn't very well designed. There's something wrong with the program. And when I saw the figures you put up, the metadata showing each of the surveys line by line, there was a huge spread in the results on the education one. Some of them showing strong correlation and very narrow uncertainties, some of them showing wide uncertainty, some of them showing anti-correlation. And it seems to me like what that's telling me, at least when I look at that data, is there are a whole bunch of different people trying to do a whole bunch of different types of environmental education, and some of them don't work very well at all, and some of them work really well. And I feel like part of the problem of doing this kind of meta-analysis of other data is that you have to sort these things into different bins. You got to figure out what they were doing that made those huge differences.
Yes, and I don't have the table in this work, but we have this whole giant table of like all the things from each program to try and sort that out. So, you know, were these young children or were they older adults? You know, so what was the age of the participants? What was the location of the participants? What was the, you know, type of educational program? Yeah, so we sorted that all out, and from what we can tell so far, there's not enough data to sort it into like this one is effective and this one isn't. Because what I was hoping would come out of it is like, if you do it this way, then that's something that we know can have this impact.
When you publish a paper that's essentially a meta-survey like this, do you give specific recommendations? Here's a gap in what people have done before that really needs to be filled in.
In this one we will be, yes. Okay. And so that is one of the gaps, is that we need more information on these EE programs to figure out why it's working sometimes and not other times. So that is actually one of the identified gaps in the data, yeah.
Other questions?
Y'all are ready to go to lunch, huh?
Was that your daughter feeding the wallabies?
Yeah, they were kangaroos actually. Yeah, that was her when she was 3. Right after we moved to Australia, we had to move all this stuff, and we had all these packing boxes and stuff. And they have all these wildlife rehab centers everywhere. So I promised her if she would just behave through all the moving stuff, that I would take her to a wildlife rehab center and we could like go pet kangaroos. And so, you know, that was her first time petting kangaroo. So they're all in a rehab center, and actually in that picture in the background, there's some like very disgruntled kangaroos outside of the fence, like laying down right next to the fence in the background, because I guess sometimes occasionally people throw them food over the fence. So they were all disgruntled, kind of hanging out back there waiting for their food. Yes, sir?
My son lives in Austin, and there it's not an option, but I guess in Nacogdoches it still is. So do you take the plastic bag? Do you personally take the plastic bag?
That is a great question. So I have a whole thing of bags in the back of my car, and sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. And it depends on if I remember. I know someone's side. I know. It's so bad. And so it's part of the examples as I use on like why environmental behaviors are different from attitudes. Behaviors require a whole other set of things to take action, and this is why anyone taking action at any point in their life is so hard, right? Because action requires this extra step. So in my case, it's my brain not remembering that all the bags are in the back of my car until I get to the checkout, and then I'm like, I'm in the checkout. I can't leave, and I'm stuck. So yeah.
I don't feel so bad now, thank you.
Yeah. No worries. I try my best, but you know, we're all human after all.
Well, otherwise we will be connecting to nature as we walk over today.
We're pre-surveying the whole survey.
Yes, yes. See you all next week.
I did not use
Thank you for coming. I already had lunch, so I won't be over with you to lunch. But I thought it was a great talk. I really enjoyed it.
Good, thanks. Thanks for coming.
I've got a supper job starting on Monday,
So were you actually cycling? You said you took this picture.
Yeah. So that's the Rio de Prata in Brazil, in Benito, Brazil. Yeah, and so it's actually a freshwater system, but it's